should not, so there probably won't be a lot of time for questions. In Isaac, we're going to really slow it down a little bit, and there'll be a lot more time. So if you want to jot your questions down, we'll kind of address them at the end if we've got time. And otherwise, we'll address them next week when we do Isaac. So thank you all for coming. And just a couple of notes. So today we're going to be talking about Abraham, one of our patriarchs, one of the founding fathers of the Hebrew faith, one of the founding fathers of the Christian faith. And so hopefully you've read that story. There are some of those you're going to go, yeah, I know that by heart. I've taught that in Sunday school, read that to my kids. And some of you are like, ooh, I hope I skipped that chapter. And we're gonna look at each one of them. Yeah. The next one is Isaac, and then we're going to take the week before Thanksgiving off. My son's going to be home, we're going to be gone, and Pastor Gary's not available. And then he's going to come back and finish up Joseph the 1st of December. And then we will come back the 8th and do Jacob, and then on the 15th we'll have a really fun Christmas presentation. I do, yes, I do. So if you don't have a flyer, I've got them over here. If somebody new comes in, if you could kind of wave at them and let them know that one. Oh, got lots, okay. You're welcome. Yeah, I've got lots. So, before we get started, I want to find out a little bit about your literature finesse knowledge. How many of you enjoy Old English writings? Yeah, got to speak. Jane Austen, fabulous. Yep. How about Shakespeare? Anybody a Shakespeare fan? Shakespeare, come see, come saw a little bit. Yeah, great authors, incredible authors, both of them, and the list goes on. But you know, it's a little hard to read them sometimes, right? Or if you go watch a play, you're like, ooh, I hope they've converted that into modern English so I can kind of get the gist of what's going on or something like that. So a couple of months ago, my girlfriend, my college roommate actually from PLU, and I went down to Ashland and saw a Shakespeare play. We saw Macbeth, the Scottish play, a great play, and I had seen it maybe 4 or 5 years earlier and enjoyed it. But this time we had the opportunity to go to what they call a preface. And it was an hour presentation about who Shakespeare was writing to, who he knew was going to be in his audience, and what kind of cultural things that were happening at the time that he incorporated into that play. So in case you're not up on your English history, Queen Elizabeth and her sister, Mary Queen of Scots, were battling for the British crown, English crown. Ultimately, Elizabeth was the queen, and but she did not have any children. Her sister, Mary Queen of Scots, did, half-sister, and her son was James VI of Scotland, Mary Queen of Scots, even though Mary lived in France. But anyway, ultimately, now, so he is going to be the heir of England on Elizabeth's death. So he is the new heir during Shakespeare's time. And so Shakespeare knows he's going to be sitting in that audience. So he writes this play, this Scottish play, and it kind of is honoring this new king. He wants some points so he can keep writing and producing plays. And it incorporates things like witches, right? What is that? Boil and trouble, however that goes. Yes. And so if you may remember back in U.S. history at about that time, we had the Salem witch trials. So this was a very cultural thing that was happening in the world at the time. So we took this preface class and we went, whoa. So this time when I saw it, the play, I enjoyed it so much more because I knew who these characters referenced to, right? I knew what their back history was. I knew what some of the cultural history was. And I really enjoyed Macbeth this time. Not that I didn't enjoy it before, but it really gave me some incredible depth for this play. As you may remember, just as a side note, King James then became the ruler of England, and he's the one that brought in the 54 people to translate the Bible into the King James Bible. So, same guy. So, anyway, this is not about Macbeth. But how many of you, but as Daddy can attest, I am a huge history fan, so now that was your first history lesson. So let me ask you about ancient, so when did Shakespeare write? Yeah, 1700s, right. So 400 years ago, right? How many of you are interested in ancient Hebrew writings? Or read those? Come on, Jim, work with me here. Okay. Ta-da! Let me introduce you to an ancient Hebrew text. When was this written? Who wrote this? Who did they write this to? This wasn't written in 2000. It wasn't written in 1500. It wasn't written in 0, right? The Old Testament was compiled, 400 years before Jesus' birth, right? But the stories go back thousands of years from here, right? So we are going to study an ancient Hebrew text, and we are going to look at it from the Hebrew perspective and from the culture that it was written in and written to. You are the King Jameses sitting in the audience, and the text is being written to you. So there was on Facebook, I saw there's a National Geographic, they have classes. They're pretty expensive. I'd love to take it, but it's called The History and Archaeology of the Bible. Once again, you may remember I love history. For a couple of years, I had I was subscribed to biblical archaeology, so I love to read that magazine. But somebody wrote back and said, a lot of those stories are plagiarized from Canaanite, Babylonian, and Sumerian myths. I'm like, hello, this is when this was written. This is who these people were. This is who wrote these books, right? So it wasn't. It is Canaanite, Sumerian, and Babylonian writings. So how long ago, when did Abraham live? Anybody know roughly? 1,000 years before Christ, 2,000 years before? Yeah, 17. Yeah, so somewhere between 15 and 2,000 years before Christ was when these stories are going to take place. So that's 4,000 years ago. We are reading an ancient Hebrew text. Correct. Yep. Yes. So I don't know. I am going to read to you from my Bible, and you may, I don't know how many times I've read my Bible. Not enough, but I was starting to pay more attention. Most of our Bibles have a little intro to the chapter. Oh my gosh, you should read that. It really adds to that depth. It's that little preface. It's a 3-minute preface on what's happening and who it's written to and when it was written, etc. And yes, in my Bible, in the whole Torah, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, it says the first book of Moses, commonly called Genesis. So these were things that were told to Moses, and these would be told to the people. So did these people that are in these stories have the 10 Commandments? No. When we're listening to these stories, you're going to have to forget that you know the rest of the story, right? You don't know anything about Jesus. In fact, in Abraham, for the first time, you're going to get a salvation story, and you're not really going to know what that means. There's going to be a promise of seed and land, but until you get to Jesus's, and that's when Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and especially Matthew, are going, listen, this is what they were talking about way back in Genesis, right? It's kind of accepted. Oh yeah, I see right there. It's so obvious, right? So it's not obvious to everyone. So 400 years after Joseph. Yeah. So I'm going to read to you the introduction to my Bible, just because I think it kind of helps set the tone here too. It says, the Old Testament may be described as the literary expression of the religious life of ancient Israel. So we are talking about the religious life of ancient Israel. More than 1,000 years of time separate the earliest and the latest compositions in the Old Testament. Once again, sort of sad that this is a book, right? Because it's 66 books. This is a library, right? This is a library. It reflects a varied social, economic, political, religious, and geographical background. The Old Testament reflects the many facets of the life of Israel, and its literature takes many forms. In it are prose and poetry, myth and legend, folklore and history, sacred hymns, and a superb love song. Religious and secular laws, proverbs of the wise and oracles of the prophets, epic poems, laments, parables, and allegories. Despite the variety in content as well as in viewpoint, there is a significant unity centered in the belief in the God of judgment and redemption, of justice and mercy. So I highly recommend that you read the intros to your Bibles. The other one that I just underlined here, and I've heard this from many people, is the Israelites were more history conscious than other cultures at that time, and even at that time, so that was very unique. So as you know, and next week we're going to look at it a little bit more. The Bible has many different categories, right? Many different genres, and sometimes even a book has multiple genres. Like you were studying Daniel, the first 4 or 5 chapters of Daniel are history, right? And what's happening. The last part of Daniel gets a little crazy out there because he's looking forward and things like that. So some books have multiple things in them, right? And sometimes we need to take them literally, like Daniel in the lion's den, right? And sometimes we need to think more about the picture of what's being painted. So these people had been in, this word came to Moses, these stories came to Moses, and they probably were told orally, right, for years. They may have been written more like a song, which we are not going to really understand that, but they're going to be lyrics built on lyrics, and sometimes you'll get a strange chapter in there in the middle, and either it was a part of a book that just kind of got a piece of paper that got stuck in there later, not paper, but piece that got stuck in there later, so it seems out of order to us, or maybe it was like the narrator wanted to throw in a little different verse to get you all to think about what's coming up in the next song, right? So there are so many ways to look at this. We are going to kind of look at this more like a song or a poem, just a little bit, because I've been listening to many, many hours from the Bible Project. And the Bible Project is that he's a Hebrew scholar who's looking at that. Many years ago, none of you in here, we studied a LifeWise class and it really talked about all the covenants. And so you could go back and look at all the covenants. You can also see in these stories, oh, they're actually talking about the Eden story again. It's a replay of the Eden story over and over again. But we're not going to get that far into those. One other thing before we kind of get started is just about taking off those, we're going to call them Western glasses, setting those apart, putting on your Eastern lens like you are a new Canaanite hearing this story for the first time, is about gods. So why were the Hebrew people so different in Egypt? Why didn't they just blend? What was the most significant difference between them and the rest of the Egyptians? One God. They're monotheistic. And so until Alexander the Great happened, most gods were animals, right? So you have stories about, the cats. There were a god in Egypt, right? Because they had a lot of power, they had a lot of wheat, they wanted to keep the rats out, so cats were very popular. So religions had animals. And if you look at their narrative stories, even like in Native American narrative stories, right? It's the animals that then create the earth, and then the people are, once Alexander the Great came around, it was about 300 years before Jesus, then they became people. And that's when we get, and I don't know my Roman from my Greek gods, so I apologize, Zeus and Apollo and, Aphrodite and all those people, right? So anyway, these people, once again, have been exposed to cultures where animals are the gods instead of having a monotheistic God. So the other quote I heard the other day, what was so interesting, is, does anyone remember how long did it take everybody after the plagues to get out of Egypt? Remember the story? One night. In fact, Moses is holding up his arm and is getting tired. And Aaron and Miriam come and help him hold the staff up. So it took one night to get those thousands of Hebrews out of Egypt. It took 40 years to get the Egypt culture out of the Hebrews. So they're not lost when they're wandering. They are spending 40 years learning these chapters that Moses is going to give them. Okay. So Debbie, where did you learn all this? How did you make this all up? You know, how much coffee did you have? Those sort of things. So I don't know why I volunteered for these. It just seemed kind of interesting. And then I thought, I don't really know anything besides what I've taught in Sunday school for decades. So I have spent multiple hours, about 15 hours, just listening to Bible Project on Abraham. And I'm still working on my last 16 hours of Isaac and Jacob. So lots of this, if you'd like much deeper perspective, you talk to me about the Bible Project. It's an app. You can just listen to it. I've also done some reading on the Beth Moore. I did not take this series, but I've been reading the notes here. And then I've been taking this wonderful Bible study class from Christy McClelland. And she is a Hebrew culturist. And she's talking about Jesus. So we're talking, almost 2,000 years before Jesus, but talking about looking at these stories through a different cultural lens, right? And I think, Jim, you were kind of relating to that earlier when you were talking about your class. So anyway, just learning a lot about looking at these stories differently. So we're going to be doing that today. Here is the way we look at it in the Western world. Okay, we think, how did that happen? Really? Was it 24 hours? When it's 24 and a half hours? What was it? How did that exactly? What's in it for me? We are a Wickham world here, especially in the United States. What's in it for me? The rest of you can figure it out on your own. I need to know how this applies to my life. We dig deep, and especially as Lutherans, we want to tear it apart, right? It's law, rule, principle. The Eastern people say, now, why did God do that? What does this tell me about God? And so if you read those Abraham stories thinking, oh, I'm getting to learn who God is, then it takes on a really different perspective. And they read it through and they kind of bring it together and they assimilate it with the Eden stories and the Noah stories. And it's a story, it's a narrative. So we're going to try to look at it from that perspective. We'll bounce back and forth. So just where we are in Abraham, and this is probably on your notes now, is I didn't put that this up here because I took it right out of this book, and I don't want to be accused of plagiarism, so I didn't pass that out to you. So here's where we have started. We have started with Adam and Eve, the creation stories, Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, two different versions of that, two different views of that. Then it went on to the Noah, the new creation story, Tower of Babel, kind of a new creation story, and we come into Abram's world. And this is where we get that first story. This is where we call the salvation history comes from, and it's from Abram. So I'm going to open my Bible and read to you. Everybody with me so far? Whew. Okay. So it actually starts at the end of Genesis, as you may or may not know. The Old Testament is basically the Hebrew Bible. In the Hebrew Bible, they do not have chapters and verses. I mean, everything is done by a heading. I don't remember why. I think they just wrote as much as they could and then put a number to it. So it seems weird to us that stories aren't exactly by chapter as we would write a book. But so in chapter 11, I'll turn my notes here, verse 26. And I'm going to read verse 27. And it says, even though it starts at 26. Now these are the descendants of Terah. Terah was the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. And Haran was the father of Lot. Haran died before his father Terah in the land of his birth in Samaria, of the Chaldeans. And Abram and Nor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarai, which means princess. And the name of Nahor's wife was Milcah, which means queen. So they're both royal. The daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarai was barren. She had no child. So from the get-go, we know that Sarah is barren. This is not something you learn on later. Some of these, if you read on, there's a lot of people names that ultimately become place names. I know some of you have really good study Bibles, and they can tell you a lot about, oh, this is telling you now how these groups of people form. These become the Mennonites, the Moabites, Hittites, or something like that. So these names would mean something to those of us who were singing that song 4,000 years ago. Moving on to chapter 12, and here is where you're going to get the first call. So chapter 12, verse 1. Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who curses you I will curse. And by you all the families of the earth shall be blessed themselves. So here is the first salvation story. It's going to come through you. There's a promise of seed, of children, and there's a promise of land. So then we read on, and we're thinking, oops, glad this is not in my Sunday school book, but we're going to go to verse 10. Now, this is a verse you probably have read in Joseph. You're going to read this in Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now there was a famine in the land. Okay, sound familiar from your Joseph stories? Now there was a famine in the land. So Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. Nice song you're singing. The famine was, it goes back. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, I know that you are a woman beautiful to behold. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say to me, this is his wife. Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me, because of you, and that my life may be spared on your account. Okay, I'm looking at that for a Western mind, and I am like, what in the world? I would kill him first before I ever got to Pharaoh, right? Sheesh. But let's go on. So pretend like you're watching Tom Cruise. They're entering a new galaxy. I don't know what it is, right? I get my actors. I'm not a movie buff, as you can tell. And you're sitting on the edge of your seat. They're going into this enemy territory, and somehow we don't want to be killed. So you go as my sister, and they're going to be fine with me, and I'm going to be able to live. There's a little bit of pride there, a little Tom Cruise-y, right? But you're like, whoo, what is going to happen here? When Abram entered Egypt, yes, okay, there we go. That's right. Yeah. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house. And for her sake, he dealt well with Abram. And he had sheep and oxen, and he gets all sorts of great things. I'm on verse 17 if you're following along. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Now remember, this is hundreds of years before Joseph, okay? So Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you have done to me? Why did you tell me that she was your wife? So here, why did you say she is my sister, so that I took her for my wife? Now then, here is your wife. Take her and be gone. So here you were sitting on the edge of your seats thinking, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? Are they going to be safe? Now they've come up with this crazy plan that Sarah's going to be the sister. Hopefully she'll be safe there with Pharaoh. Oh my gosh, what is going to happen? And what happens? God comes galloping in on a white horse and saves Sarai. So this isn't a story about how dumb Abram is, or clueless or whatever, or how afraid they are. This is a story that the Hebrew people, learning about who their God was, they don't have the 10 Commandments, they're learning about who their God was, and they see that God is a rescue God. You are safe. He is going to come rescue you. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Long history.
One of the areas where Jews were allowed to have spouses.
Yeah. 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 There's just so much in these stories. Like I said, I've compiled 10 hours just of Bible project to get this 45 minutes for you. So there's so many things going on here. So in the next chapter, chapter 13, We have a really nice chapter, and you're like, yes, Abram, you got it. So they are so successful. He's taken his nephew with him, right? Because he's an orphan. And so they're very successful. They're living happily. The Pharaoh's not bothering them. And but they are too successful. And Abram's herdsmen and Lot's herdsmen are battling over water. You can't always use my well. They get them in the morning. I want it in the morning. Things like that. And so Abram says, Lot, let's meet and talk and look at all this land that God has promised me. Let's not fight. So he has this incredible diplomacy. He says, Lot, you pick the land. You go first. What a wonderful, righteous, merciful part Abram is playing here. And you're like, yes, Abram, maybe you learned from the Pharaoh last time. God's in control. Maybe you lean more on God. And so they divide the land. Lot, of course, takes the good land. He looks down into the valley and sees these cities. Of course, Sodom and Gomorrah are down in there, and other cities are down there. And he sees that, and he said, I want that good pasture land. That looks like the easy life for me. That's for me. And Abram says, fine, I'll take this hill country. You go down there. Okay, Abram, you're taking the high road here. In chapter 14, it gets very historical, very kind of crazy about these city-state sort of things are battling down there. The kings of these different cities are battling. And in the middle of this battle, they capture Lot. And Abram's kind of stayed out of this. But once they capture Lot and his people, we get another rescue story. And this time, Abram is walking with the Lord, and he goes down and he rescues Lot. And he takes nothing. He says, I don't want any of the riches. I don't want anything like that. I just want Lot and his people. And so another good story about Abram kind of doing the right thing here. Moving on to 16. I don't know what time we're on here, but actually I'm going to go back to 15. Yeah. So then we get back into 15. Okay, 15. So this is what we call, this is God's covenant. And like I said, many years ago, about 25 years ago, I did all these stories, really looking at all these covenants. So if you want to look at it from that perspective, I think Lifeways has a really good program on that. But this is God's covenant with Abram. This is what we call the divine covenant. So starting in verse 1, after these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, which is what all good angels say, or the Lord when he appears to you. So if any angel comes up and starts talking to you and does not start with fear not, then you might have to check his ID. Okay. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord, what wilt thou give me? For I continue to be childless. And the heir to my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, Behold, thou hast given me no offspring, and a slave born in my house will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him. This man shall not be your heir. Your own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them. Then he said to Abram, So shall your descendants be. And he believed the Lord, and he reckoned it to himself as righteousness. So wonderful conversation. I love any time where the narrator puts in where God is having a one-on-one conversation with anyone in the Bible. And so then they have a covenant, a formal covenant where they offer sacrifices, they divide the animals, and you can read all the details there. Moving on to 16. 16 is now 10 years later. Nothing has really happened. Still no kids. So 10 years later, what is God's plan? Maybe the plan is for my maidservant to have my child. And maybe this is, Sarai would like, we need an heir. Probably Hagar is probably very close to Sarai. They may be best friends, right? But Sarai was over her, but they're probably pretty close. And she says, you know what? Here's Hagar. Why don't you impregnate her and that heir will be our son? And that, sounds like a good idea. Well, yeah, women all laugh and say, yeah, maybe not so much, right? Yeah. So for some reason, now they are going to take it in their own hands instead of figuring out, leaning on God and say, where is this? What's going on? How can you help me? They take it into their own hands. And that's really hard, right? How often do we hear the word of God? How do we know when he's prompting us to give the maidservant or when he's prompting us to wait, right? So it's easy to condemn Sarai. At the same time, we're not good at waiting, and it's been a long time. And sometimes we take those steps forward. So anyway, this story you're probably relatively familiar with. Hagar becomes pregnant, and then she goes because she actually does become a wife to him because a child not of your wife can't inherit. So now they're like equals. In fact, she's a little bit above Sarai. Sarai's not too happy with that, right? And she becomes very, very jealous, and she is very, very mean to Hagar. And Hagar flees. And she goes to some very interesting locations. You could also read all of these just about where they go and the meanings of these wells and these trees, going back to the Garden of Eden, things like that. So she goes and she sits under a tree, and an angel comes and rescues her there and says, "Go back, I will bless your son." So a couple of lines that I underlined in chapter 16, if you're with me. One is really reckoning with going back to the Eden story, is if you go to verse, maybe two. And Sarai said to Abram, "Behold now, the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. Go into my maid, it may be that I shall obtain children by her." And Abram hearkened to the voice of Sarai. Does that sound like maybe Adam saying, "Sure, Eve, I'll take a bite of that. Let's chew on that apple," right? So these people are going to hear that story in there. They are going to recognize this as, oh, this has happened before and it didn't turn out well, right? So if we go to the end of 16, in verse 16, Abram was 86 years old. So this is another 13 years later. So Ishmael is now 13. And God appears to Abram when he's 99, 13 years later. And we have this promise of the covenant of circumcision. Now, circumcision is unique in that all of the Hebrew people are circumcised, but there were other cultures that also did circumcise. So it wasn't like, whoa, never ever heard of that before. So other cultures were doing that, just not, maybe it would be a family or maybe one king or ruler would say, but it was practiced. But now it's really, so it's an external sign. This is the first time they've had an external covenant with God. And at this time is when we have in verse, well, we'll just start with verse 17. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to Abram and said to him, "I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless. And I will make my covenant between me and you, and will multiply you exceedingly." He's 99. He's been promising this for a long time, years and years and years. How frustrated do you get when God doesn't answer your prayer in a week? All right? Then Abram fell on his face, and God said, "Behold, my covenant is with you, and you shall be the father of a multitude of nations." Once again, this promise of land and seed. "You shall no longer shall your name be Abram," which means father, great father, "but your name shall be Abraham," which means father of a multitude. "For I have made you the father of a multitude of nations. I will make you exceedingly fruitful." Once again, another, why do we say fruitful and multiply, right? That resonates way back to the Eden story. That's where we get that phrase. "And I will make nations of you, and kings shall come forth from you, and I will establish my covenant between me and you." So then he goes on and describes who needs to be circumcised, all those sort of details. And then in verse 15, we get Sarai's name is changed. And God said to Abraham, as for Sarai, your wife, you shall not call her name Sarai, but Sarah shall be her name. In verse 17, then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, so the narrator, we were watching this play, and now all of a sudden, the narrator sees, the spotlight's focused on Abraham, and he's like, whew, and this is what you hear him, everybody's freeze framed, but Abraham's not frozen. And Abraham said to himself, shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? Spotlight went over to God. Everybody else was frozen. God heard him. And Abraham said to God, oh, that Ishmael might live in thy sight. He wants Ishmael to be his heir. He loves his son Ishmael. God said, no, but Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. As for Ishmael, I have heard you. Behold, I will bless him and make him fruitful and multiply him exceedingly. He shall be the father of 12 princes, and I will make him a great nation. But I will establish my covenant with Isaac, whom Sarah shall bear to you at this season next year. So a great story there about the promise of Isaac and his relationship with Ishmael, right? Okay, chapter 18. So in 18, look at my notes once in a while and make sure I'm 18, this is years later now. Abraham is sitting outside his tent. Always when you read about Abraham, it's going to refer to a tent. He is a nomad. He doesn't have a permanent home. When you read the story of Lot, he closes a door. He lives in a building. So we need to remember that Abraham is a nomad. And, and so Abraham is sitting outside his tent, and these three men appear. Was it, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit? Was it God and, a couple of angels? Lots of discussion there. But these three men approach. And the Middle Eastern culture, once again, we have to really take off our glasses because this is not something that we embrace in the United States at all. When you go into a restaurant, you order number 1, your husband orders number 17, and you do not touch each other's plates, right? In other cultures in the world, I'm taking Spanish right now and learning about other cultures in the Spanish, everybody puts the food on the table and everybody eats, right? They are a sharing, loving culture. When you walk out of a restaurant, you say good day to everybody as you leave, whether you know them or not. They're very loving. They like to live together, not us. We have a room for every single one of our children. We don't share our food. You plate it and you sit down at the table in your spot. So that is not where a lot of the world today lives, and certainly not where these people lived. So they are going to do this hospitality. Hospitality is the king. And many, many stories throughout the Bible, you will read this. The story slows down as he goes in and he talks to Sarai. Make the bread, knead the bread. Okay, kneaded bread takes a long time to get done. It doesn't slap the tortilla on the hot stone, right? So it's going to take, she's doing a big preparation, kill the fatted calf, all this big story about this preparation for this meal and really encouraging these men and embracing that they're coming. So these men come and they sit outside and they're talking. And in verse 9, they said to Abraham, where is Sarah, your wife? And he said, she is in the tent. The Lord said, I will surely return to you in the spring, and Sarah, your wife, shall have a son. And Sarah was listening at the door. Once again, you can kind of see the play happening. You're watching this, and you see her kind of off stage looking. And Sarah was listening at the tent door behind him. Now Abraham and Sarah were old, advanced in age. It had ceased to be with Sarah after a manner of women. So Sarah laughed to herself. Did she laugh like, yeah, you're crazy, buddy? Or did she laugh and say, is this really going to happen to me? The narrator doesn't tell us what happens there. After I have grown old and my husband is old, shall I have the pleasure The Lord said to Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh? And shall I indeed bear a child now that I'm old? Is anything too hard for the Lord?" Now we can think forward, and think about, all things are possible with God. "At the appointed time, I will return to you in the spring, and Sarah shall have a son." But Sarah denied, saying, "I didn't laugh," for she was afraid. And he said, "No, but you did laugh." I love that. I love those dialogues. I love God talking right to us, talking right to Sarah, right? There are many things in these chapters that we do not teach in Sunday school, but there are, but there are. In fact, even as adults, sometimes you want to go la 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 la. But I remember as a kid learning just the clean PG rate versions of these stories and loving these women, right? These were Rachel, Rebecca, and Sarah. I just thought those were the most beautiful names ever. These were strong women who had conversations with God. And I loved these women. So, and you read that they're flawed, just like Abraham is. So So then the men left. The story changes here, and but I love this next conversation. If you go to verse 17. So it says the men sent out from there. So the men are leaving. They've had a great meal, and they're going to go down to Sodom and Gomorrah because they heard the cries there. And the Lord said, "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do?" Once again, freeze frame, spotlight on God. "Shall I hide from Abraham what I'm about to do? Seeing that Abraham shall become a great nation, and all the nations of the earth shall bless themselves by him? No, for I have chosen him that he may charge his children and his household after him, to keep the way of the Lord by doing righteousness and justice." And so God talks to Abraham about what he's going to do. And the rest of the story, we have to make sure we're not looking at it from, he's not negotiating with God. There's nowhere in here that God said, "I'm going to go down and destroy those people." There's nowhere in here that God said, "I'm going to go down and destroy if they're 50-50. Nothing like this. Abraham pops up and says, "Woo! Wait a second. What if there are 50 good people down there?" And then he has this wonderful dialogue. What if there's 45? He has this wonderful dialogue. What if there's 30? And he gets down to 10. In the notes of my Bible, it says here that here the issue is put the other way around. Can the righteous of a few, even a minority of 10, have the saving influence upon the world? So he goes, the Lord, and that go down to Sodom and Gomorrah. And does anybody remember how many righteous people they found? Well, they got Lot, his wife, and his 2 daughters, ultimately. And then the wife looks back. We're not going to talk about the Sodom and Gomorrah story because it's not about Abraham, but you should read it. And it's got some really weird stuff at the end about Lot and his daughters, which may have meant to be weird. This is to kind of get you thinking. But what also it is telling you is that is the line that Ruth is ultimately going to come from. So maybe now when you're going to be hearing the Ruth story, you're going to go, "Oh, hey, wasn't that the family way back when?" So something good did come out of that story. That's all I'm going to say on that story. Okay. So we're going to finish up here. I don't know what time it is. How much time have I got left here? We're going to finish this up here with Abimelech. So in chapter 20, let's see if there was anything I had. Chapter 20, verse 1. From there, Abraham journeyed toward the territory of the Negeb. So he's going from Canaan, the area of Canaan, and down south towards Egypt. But before he gets to Egypt, he gets into Gerar. Starting in verse 2. And Abraham and Sarah said of Sarah, his wife, "She is my sister." Oh my gosh. Really? How many years has it been? And you're saying the whole sister thing again? Saving your skin? And Abimelech, king of Gerar, sent and took Sarah. But God came to Abimelech. God came to Abimelech. God came to Abimelech. We've not read about Abimelech before. We will read about him again. He's not related to Abraham. And he has a conversation with God. Abimelech does. God came to Abimelech, in a dream by night and said to him, "Behold, you are a dead man because of the woman whom you have taken, for she is a man's wife." Now Abimelech had not approached her. So he said, "Lord, wilt thou slay an innocent people? He did not himself say to me, 'She is my sister.' She herself said, 'He is my brother.' In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands, I have done this." Then God said to him, "Yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it is I who kept you from sinning against thee. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. Now then, restore the man's wife, for he is a prophet, and he will pray for you." So Abimelech goes out to Abraham and says, "Why did you do this to me? Why did you lie like this?" Abimelech called Abraham and said to him, I'm in verse 9, "What have you done to us? And how have I sinned against you, that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin? You have done things to me that ought not to be done." You think Abraham had kind of figured it out, and then he does another fool thing like this. Now, when you read on, then the rest of it, you're not going to like Abraham. In verse 10, or 11, verse 10, "I did it because I thought," okay, maybe you should have had a good prayer session with God about, hey, I'm getting into the Negeb with these people. "Besides, she is my sister." And then you go on about him backpedaling. "She is my sister. I didn't really, and I asked her before we did this." And it's kind of a crazy story. So once again, the Lord comes in and saves Sarah. That is as far as we're going to go with Abraham. Obviously, we have that we're going to move into Isaac just because it has taken us 50 minutes to get this far. So we're going to pick up Isaac where you may actually think that's the Abraham story, but we've kind of run out of time if we do it differently than that. So before I excuse you, any questions, comments, concerns, thoughts? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he's going to have a couple interactions with this family, with the family of Abraham. He's a good guy.
How many times God is talking to people that are Jews?
Right. That's exactly right. That's right. Sometimes we think,
about all.
Yes, sometimes we think that this is only the Hebrew people were saved, right? This is where the salvation story. So this book is leading us to Jesus, but it does not mean, to your point exactly, that he's not working in the rest of the world, that he's not talking to other people, not bringing other people, to him and things like that. We can't have all those stories. We're just going to look in the Bible about this one story that ultimately leads us to Jesus.
It's also interesting to think about how many Philistines are still around.
Yeah.
How many Sumerians
Right.
are still around?
Yeah.
How many Babylonians?
Yeah.
How many Chaldeans are still around?
Yeah.
There aren't any.
Yeah.
I mean, there's the results of those descendants, but as a people,
Right.
with a culture,
That's exactly right.
there's one.
That's right. All of those creation stories. Almost every culture has a flood story, right? Is anybody worshiping any of those people anymore? Right? It's even like when you look at the creation story, and sometimes we're like, okay, does that, now we've got science that shows us, well, yeah, you know what? When you look at it, so how did it happen? We don't know. It was something big. God all of a sudden, there it was. It could have been a bang. I don't know, but it happened. And then what happened first? They separated the waters. We've got plates moving. Then first of all, we have plants. Then we have animals. Then we have people. It totally lines up what happened, right? These real stories where if you looked at other cultures, it started with the animals and then the stars. Nothing aligns. Where these stories align still to this day. Yeah, these people are still here today. Those other religions have come and gone, and yeah, still alive. So thank you very much. See you next week on Isaac.